Welcome to our session on the Aleph base. This is our fifth session, and we're going to look at the letter Hey. And the letter Hey is a very, very profound letter in many, many different ways. Now, its shape, as you recognize, is containing three elements. Just look at your letter Hey on your sheet, which you received last week, and you'll find that there are the three elements: the roof, the top, the side, and then seems to be an element of an upside down yud, if you look at it closely, as a foot that's separated from the letter dalet itself. So let's have a closer look at the letter Hey. The letter Hey is a very holy letter because it is often used as a substitute for God as such. In other words, instead of writing God's name down, just in case that particular piece of paper which we are writing on might be torn or desecrated, we never write God's name down. We use a substitute, and the letter Hey is the substitute that we used for the name of God. Also, let's look at the sequence that we've been talking about. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. Now, the Aleph, we said, was the person, the Jewish person living in his home, in her home. Aleph representing leadership and personality. It's the essence of everything. It's the letter which begins the construction of everything. The nothingness before even creation took place, as the Kabbalists describe. And it's got seniority. The word aluf, which today means general, a general in the military service, leadership. And of course, we said then that the letter Beit means bayit, house. The individual has a home, a roof over his head, over her head, and under those circumstances, a person feels that they have a sense of possession, ownership, and groundedness. Once that combination has taken place, then we're in a position to share and give of ourselves. Gimel, from Gomel, to be able to contribute and to give of ourselves as an act of kindness, which is one of the natural aspects of creation. And then who do we give it to? The Dalet. What is Dalet? Delete, the one who doesn't have, those in need. God creates a circumstances set in the world whereby there are givers and receivers. And that is because this has to draw from each one of us our capacity to give. For that, there has to be a set of receivers to receive it as such, those who don't have. Which brings us to our letter now. So how do we continue this sequence of thought in context of the Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey? Put yourself in a position of someone in need, someone who possesses dignity and yet needs, someone who perhaps had been used to having and has lost it. To ask, to beg, even to receive gratuitously is a very, very tall ask for such a person. And therefore, if we can anticipate that and give to such a person in such a way that they don't feel in any way lacking, of course, all the better. But in their heart, as they receive, there is a sense of relief. And the letter Hey has no sound to speak of. It does have a sound. It's not like the Aleph that's soundless. Hey is called the light letter. It's the letter of breath. It's so light that it can barely be heard. It's the sense of sigh as the person receives, an inner sigh, doesn't want to demonstrate and show necessarily, but there is an inner sigh taking place, the letter of Hey. There's an easier breathing. We know in our tradition that breath reveals our state of emotions and our state of mind. The way we breathe reflects it. In a state of stress, anxiousness, we tend to breathe faster and perhaps more audibly. If we are physically stressed because we've run the gauntlet of a 100-meter race, then we're heaving and the breathing is heavy in order to oxygenate the body. But then there's the silent hay, the silent breathing, the breathing which isn't so overt. And that's the breathing of a sense of equanimity, a sense of relief, a sense of, how did I get myself out of this mess? Thank God that Hashem sent me someone who can relieve my distress as such. That's all implicit in the letter Hey. Now, the three elements of the letter Hey, the top, the side, and that broken foot, it's not connected, it's dislocated, because the word Hey also means broken. And when we speak about broken, the letter Hey also represents the breaking of the ego abnegation. Now, what do we mean by this complex term, ego abnegation? On the one hand, we're taught, certainly by psychologists, that it's very important to have a sense of self. We distinguished in previous conversations between this healthy sense of self and an unhealthy sense of self, egotism as such. And we call that state of yeshus. Person who thinks highly of themselves is colloquially called a yesh in our tradition. Nevertheless, the idea we're trying to convey is ego abnegation means to be able to recognize that our sense of self doesn't come from our self-developed greatness, from our personal accomplishment, but rather from a giftedness that was provided to us from above, whether genetically it was provided from above or circumstantially it was provided from above. In this particular week, the Australian had a list of the 250 richest in Australia. And I was wondering, as I was looking at that, I wonder how many of these are truly humble. I'm sure many of them, in fact, are. But there's such a trap for many people who have achieved to think, it's from me. I did it by myself. Good old me. Instead of saying, no, what I have found out is that Hashem, God, trusts me to be a guardian, a receptacle for blessings. Why me? Because I have the capacity to share and give. I have the capacity of the Gimel to give to the Dalet. And I'm able to have a sense in people of the breath of Hay, in other words, the relief. And indeed, many a major billionaire has created wonderful possibilities of being able to give back to society, and that is commendable to the highest degree. But many of us, whether wealthy or not wealthy, all too often just think too much of our own inner achievements or external achievements as something I did. Of course, my work, the effort I put in, creates a vessel, a conduit for the bracha, for the blessing to flow through to my circumstance in order that I can be a much bigger and better contributor as such, 100%. But nevertheless, to remember, the letter Hey, the silent letter, also tells us that we have our own limitations, and it's not our choice whether we receive or not. Our choice is to create the vessel. And then, if we're worthy enough, we'll receive, and we're deemed worthy of receiving. So that's all implicit in the letter Hey also. But I began to say that there are three elements. And those three elements are machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh. What in Hasidic teachings are thought, speech, and activity. Now, the top being machshava, thought, is the beginning point. It's at the top. That's when inspiration begins to take place from somewhere above us into us. By the time it gets to dibur, the second stage of speech, it's already been processed, and it's been processed to a state where we can actually enunciate and speak about it. Even if we speak to ourselves in a planning stage. But at the end of the day, the proof in the pudding is if we act it out, if we do it. And we can do it right, and we can do it wrong. And therefore that little element, which is the foot of the letter A cislocated, can either become one that elevates the whole letter or degrades the whole letter. It's hanging five, so to speak. And I have the capacity to make the action elevate the whole letter so that the person who delays, the dalet, who doesn't have, actually receives in an honorable way or doesn't receive in an honorable way. So that's another element of the shape of the letter Hey as such. Now, we spoke last week about groups of fours, because we were speaking about the letter Dalet. We raised a number of different groups of fours. Truth to be that each of the groups of fours actually has an ephemeral fifth level. So if we take, for example, what we said last week, that the soul has the levels of nefesh, ruach, neshama, and chaya, and that these four levels correspond to the four worlds of Asiya, which we have our experience in, of time and space, Yetzirah, the next realm above that's so removed we can't even begin to experience it because it has no time or space. Then there's a realm of creation above it called Bria, and then there's a realm above that called Atzilus, from the word Eitzel, which is so proximate to Hashem that we can't distinguish it as really anything quite separate. Four realms. Now, having said that, there is a fifth level of the soul that actually corresponds to yet a fifth level of the worlds. We said Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya. There's a level called Yechida, the highest level. And it corresponds in the realm of the worlds, Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, Atzilus, to another one, Ein Sof. You have that here in the notes at the table. What is Yechida and what is Ein Sof? Yechida is that element of our soul that is able to, fantastically, appreciate infinity. Ein Sof, without end, infinity, or godliness. We can't speak about God. We can speak about godliness. God, by definition, is beyond mind, beyond emotion, no capacity of the human being to begin such a discussion as to what is God, per se. All we can talk about is the expression of God, which I guess we can call godliness, for want of a better word. And the Yechida level, the highest level of the soul, relates to godliness. And that's why we can do things sometimes that go totally beyond the realm of reason. Why someone might even practice, God forbid, Mesiras Nefesh, giving up their life to save someone else, without any reason, rationality as such, because obviously our major activities to save ourselves. We're always involved in maintaining our security. Therefore, to give that up, that's amazing. And that corresponds to the Yechida level. So you can see there's a fifth level in each of these tabular elements, and that corresponds to the letter Hey. And the letter Hey, as I said before, represents godliness as such. So it's something that goes beyond. And we can, for example, see it in another expression. We know that the Torah, as I explained to you, was given at 4 different levels of insight, right there at Mount Sinai. Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, which makes up the word Parades, which means orchard, but mystically it means the orchard of Torah at 4 distinct levels. And I explained to you, Pshat is the plain meaning, the meaning of the words. Remez is what the words allude to. Drush is when we take it to metaphoric level. Sod is when we talk about Kabbalah and we're talking about abstracting it to energies and forces and mathematical constructs, etc., etc. So we spoke about those four levels, but today we're talking about, hey, a fifth level. What do we mean by a fifth level as such? Chassidus. Now that came much later in history. The four levels I spoke to you about, they were given at Mount Sinai. Even Kabbalah was given at Mount Sinai. It was kept as a subterranean tradition and only became codified much, much later in history, some 1800 years later, by the very, very famous individual who codified all of it into some meaningful form, right? And then it was published eventually by Moses de Leon as such. And then ultimately that became the subject matter of learning. But that was given back at Mount Sinai. Later in history, much later in history, 18th century, early 18th century, in the person of the Baal Shem Tov, yet another level of Torah was provided. And we call that Chassidut, Chassidus. And that level, which is sometimes equated with Kabbalah, but it's not really. Yes, it explicates Kabbalah as well. It explains the Kabbalah as well. But Chassidus is another level altogether that gives another level of life to the meaning and our capacity to have a sense of both joie de vivre on the one hand and profound, intense intellectual endeavor on the other hand, at a level that previously was unavailable. So that is the fifth level of the study of the Torah and corresponds again to the letter He and the capacity of having yet a fifth level as such. And we know that there are 5 books of Moses. And although the first 4 books record everything that's needed in the Chumash, Bereshis, Shemos, Vayikra, which we're going to be starting this coming Shabbos, and Bamidbar, and yet there was a 5th book, Devarim, which repeats basically the other 4 books. Why do we need a 5th book, which is seemingly a repetition of the other 4 books? So the Lubavitch Rebbe explained this in a very beautiful way. What we are given in the Torah is from Hashem, from God. The 4 books very exactly convey what Hashem dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. The 5th book represents how Moshe Rabbeinu taught the Jewish people the content of those 4 books. And of course, he didn't deviate at all. So you might say, well, that's redundant. Why do we need Moses' rendition of it also to be recorded? So the Rebbe explains that in order to take divinity and allow it to become part and parcel of the reality of an ordinary, seemingly mundane world, there is a need for a human being to take the Torah teachings that God gives and be able to translate it through his own being, through his voice, through his throat, so to speak. And therefore what we find is Moses repeating, but in his own words, and thereby making it much more accessible at the lowest level. And that 5th level enables each one of us to be able to practice the Torah at an earthly level, only through the agency of Moshe Rabbeinu having been able to retranslate, so to speak, Hashem's inspiration within him into a verbal format that was true to the world that he and us find ourselves in. So that's another 5th level that's representative of the letter He, which means the 5th level. So you can see there are many groups of 5 that come through that are under the rubric of the letter He as such. So these are the kind of things that I wanted to share with you. But there's one more very, very important factor. The letter He creates femininity. In other words, the feminine side employs the letter He. You find in Hebrew that there are words which are masculine, like the word yeled, which means boy. Girl is yalda, the same three letters, yud lamet dalet, with a He on it. Yeled is without the He. Yalda is the same three letters, different undervowels, admittedly, but a letter He on it. And generally speaking, when we add the letter He to many nouns, it makes them feminine forms of the masculine. So one of the other important aspects of the letter He is that it represents the feminine side of the Godhead. Now, what does it mean, the feminine side of the Godhead? God is both masculine and feminine. And that's why everything in the world possesses the dichotomy of masculinity and femininity. But having said that, the truth is that some elements in the world are more dominantly feminine and some are more dominantly masculine. Men are more dominantly masculine, although they have a feminine nature as well. Women are more dominantly feminine, but there's a recessive masculine nature as well. So there's constantly the duality of masculinity and femininity. Femininity, but basically, however, represents nurture, dwelling within, being able to support the life per se. And that is the nature of God, as God is able to operate, so to speak, at the ground floor level of world. The feminine side of the Godhead nurtures creation, is within it, and therefore earth, soil, the ground is feminine, because the ground is that part of our existence that nurtures a seed and allows it to grow and sprout. And one of the most important features of earth is that it becomes the grounding of all growth. That's a feminine quality. So this idea of masculine and femininity is also a dichotomy that's found in all things, and the letter He representing the feminine side of those things. So with another dimension of the letter He is exactly that we have a notion of masculinity and femininity latent in the letter He. You remember how the letter He also changed the course of history. Abraham and Sarah, Avraham and Sarah. What was Abraham's first name? Former name, I should say, previous to his gaining of a second name. It was Avram, without a letter He. Only later he was given the letter He, and Avram became Avraham. Abram became Abraham. Do you remember when that took place? When Avram, who was a very, very great thinker and rediscovered monotheism and began the basis of the Hebrew nation, but he was also very worldly, and he studied every aspect of thought, philosophy, in order to be able to get to his answer that ultimately there's one God, monotheism as such. But he also picked up a lot of information like astrology, and he was an accurate astrologer in his day. He looks into the stars, as the Chumash tells us, and he says to God, God, I'm not going to have any children. I can see it. It's astrologically predicted. I'm not going to have any children. So God says to him, put aside your astrological charts. I'm going to add just one letter to your name, and the whole future prediction is totally altered. You'll no longer be Abram, you'll be Abraham. And as a consequence of that, you will have children. I change your future with the letter He. And Sarah likewise. Sarah's first name used to be Sarai, with a yud at the end. And that little letter yud became transformed to a hey. And Sarai became Sarah, Sarah. And the letter hey again was the agency of that change that created for Abraham and Sarah a family that you and I are the descendants of. That you and I, we're talking about our great, 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 great grandmother and grandfather going back 40 plus generations per se. So letter hey plays such a significant role. One more that comes to mind. There are two narratives of creation sequentially following each other, and there's a reason for that. I mean, Bible critics say, oh, here you are. You have here two narratives. In other words, one supersedes the other. Well, we forget all that because we know full well the purposefulness of every letter of the Torah and every word of the Torah. We have Rashi and the Mefarshim explaining it. Bible critics can't even begin to understand the mammoth amount of learning that is able to introspect into the Torah as such. Anyway, in the supposedly second narrative, it says, and these are the generations, etc., of the world, Behiboram, when Hashem created them. Now, the word Behiboram has an extra hey in it. And that letter hey represents God again. And God created the world primarily with the letter hey. And that's how we find another important feature and factor of creation, that the letter hey, Behiboram, the h sound is there, which means that the creation of the world was very much based on the letter hey. Now, of course, these things are not easily understood. Even the words that I used doesn't mean that I've explained the notion. What does it mean the world was created with the letter hey? I've sort of taken as a fait accompli that everyone understands that. But in the scope of our sessions, we haven't got the ability to be able to explore that. Perhaps we'll spend time just on that alone. So these were just a few thoughts on the letter hey. And what we have done in these 5 classes is perhaps given us a sense that within Torah Judaism, within Yiddishkeit, there's a depth of insight that perhaps the superficial kind of Jewish studies, even what we learn at university that we call Jewish studies, is so superficial compared to what the tradition is able to offer us. And in our sessions, we are calling upon the deeper labyrinths as well of Kabbalah and Hasidus, the 5th level of today. So I'm hoping that this series has opened up the eyes of many and has provided you with an incentive to go further. If you want to have an excellent book on the Hebrew alphabet, going all the way to the end, I personally recommend Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg's book, which happens to be very uniquely and creatively called the Alef Beit. So you can possibly try to get hold of that. I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, so you will look on Amazon and see if you can find some copies that are still extant. I wish you a lot of success. It's been a pleasure to do this series for you. Be well. Bye.